Hello, hello, hello. I am your host, Tracy Otsuka. Thank you so much for joining me here for another episode of ADHD for Smartass Women. You know my purpose. It is always to show you who you are and then inspire you to be it. And in the thousands of ADHD women that I've had the privilege of meeting, I've never met a one that wasn't truly brilliant at something not one. So, of course, I am just delighted to introduce you to Kendall Marie Platt. Kendall Platt is the mindful gardening coach. She helps women take time out of their busy lives to quiet their minds while also creating a beautiful garden. Kendall was diagnosed with ADHD last year at the age of 36 and has been using mindful gardening to manage her busy brain for the last 10 years. She grew up on the south coast of England, Gardens, of course, you're British, and now lives with her husband and two little girls near Reading, England. Kendall spent a lot of life struggling with anxiety. Now she's ripping up the rule book and encouraging overworked and overwhelmed women to join her in the mindful gardening revolution. Welcome, Kendall. Did I get all of that right?
Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Yeah, what an intro, hey? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm delighted to have you here. So, you know that where we always start is we talk about the ADHD diagnoses. And so I'd love to hear your story if you'd share it with us.
It started a while ago. I don't know how it is in the States in terms of diagnosis, but in the UK, it takes a long time to get it. So I, like I said, have always struggled with anxiety and felt, like I was a bit different, but I didn't know anything else, that was just who I was. And I just kind of carried on going through life, having little moments of hyperfocus and interest here and other things that I struggled with. But I just kind of thought, it's just who I am. And then probably about 3 or 4 years ago now, I started to read a little bit more about, the anxiety that I was experiencing. And I was thinking to myself, I'm doing all the things that they're saying I should do. And it doesn't really seem to be working. I was using my gardening, which was helping a bit, but I was still, coming back, I'd be okay for a bit and then I'd struggle again. And I was like, what else is going on? So I started to read a bit and, listen to podcasts, not that there were as many of them back then, but, to try and kind of educate myself. And I came across ADHD and I thought to myself, oh, well, I can't have that because I was really good in school. I did really, really well and, got 2 degrees and A level, I did really well, basically. I was like, I can't have that. There's no way I can. And then, of course, more and more people started to talk about actually how ADHD presented in women. And I was like, oh, hang on a minute. This sounds familiar. And whilst there's definitely things that, some ADHD women struggle with that I don't struggle with, the vast majority of the things people were talking about, I was like, hang on, this sounds so familiar. So I started to read a bit more around it. And then I started to look into how I could get diagnosed, if I needed to get diagnosed. If I got diagnosed, what would that mean? And I thought, do you know what? I'm just going to refer. Basically, I could just self-refer to my doctor. In the UK, you can fill in the form and you tick what symptoms you have. You send it to your doctor, and there's a thing called right to choose in the UK, and the doctor can refer you to that. And it's actually, we have the national health system in England, which is free healthcare. Basically, we don't have to pay for it. And Right to Choose is a private company, but they have a contract with the NHS. So you as the patient don't have to pay for the diagnoses. So I got my doctor to send that off. And then they sent me many forms to fill in, at which point I thought, oh, I don't think I really want to do this, because actually the thought of sitting and filling in loads of forms and really digging through my experiences, actually, I didn't really want to face up to that. That was really quite scary to me. And also the other thing that I didn't want to do was I didn't want to have to ask my nearest and dearest to critique me, is kind of how I was viewing it. I was, one of the big ways that ADHD shows up for me is being really quite sensitive and, struggling with rejection. So the thought of asking somebody that's really close to me, that I really care about, to list all the ways that I struggle, was really not something I wanted to do. So I sat on it, to be honest, for about a year and a half. Started implementing some of the things and tips that I was hearing about, even without a diagnosis. I was thinking, well, I can do that. I don't need a diagnosis to try some of these things that people are suggesting. But eventually it got to the point where I was like, do you know what? I just need to get on and do this. They kept sending me reminder emails. I was like, oh, I just need to do this. I am a bit of a, I like to follow the rules, put it that way, in certain respects. And when somebody sort of reminding me of things, I keep thinking, yes, I must do it, like many of us, I think. And then unless I put it in my calendar to do it, it goes out of my brain. So I just put it in my calendar.
Yeah.
And I picked up the phone to them and I said, I need to book in for my assessment, thinking they would say, oh, it's like 6 months, a year long wait. And the woman was like, have you filled in your forms? And I said, oh, I haven't done them yet. And she was like, oh, I won't book you until the end of the month then. And I was like, so you've got time to do them? And I was like, oh, right. I said, oh, I think I was expecting to have to wait 6 months. And I'd kind of called to book the appointment to give me that deadline, because obviously, we love a deadline. So anyway, then I did have my deadline just much sooner than I thought. And I literally had a couple of weeks to fill in the forms. And I braved it. And I asked my husband if he would fill in the form. And if I'm really honest, that did not go so well, because he ticked that I didn't showcase any of those things, which I was a bit like, okay, how on earth can you not think that I struggle with these things? But that just shows how good I was at masking, I think.
Yeah.
And then eventually I had my assessment, and actually the psychiatrist that assessed me, he said, usually the parent survey or the partner survey, the family member survey, he said that's usually used for children who can't communicate as well the struggles they're having, whereas I could obviously quite openly tell him how I'd been struggling. So he was like, I'm really not worried about that at all. And then look, at the end of the assessment, he was like, yeah, I think you've got ADHD. The thing that they do in the UK, I don't know what it's like in the States, but in the UK, they basically say the only option we have is to medicate you. So I'll put you on the waiting list to get medication. And I was like, oh, I'm not really sure if I want to go down that route. That seems, he explained about all the drugs and that they were like stimulant medication. And as someone who's never done any recreational drugs in their entire life, and actually, I worked as a forensic scientist for many years, even though they're obviously licensed, taking stimulant medication for me felt really intimidating. I was like, I'm not sure if I want to do that. So again, I procrastinated. And then eventually I decided that at the moment it wasn't for me. I wanted to try other things to see if they could help me, manage my symptoms. And largely, I've been all right. I'm doing much better than I was. And interestingly for me, it was more the awareness of things I could do. The diagnosis, I think the diagnosis allowed me to give myself a bit of grace. But I don't think it necessarily, I think I already knew I had it, I didn't need really that stamp of approval or that bit of paper to say I had it. I knew, and I was already trying to help myself in ways before I'd had the diagnosis. So for me, I think just having somebody else validate my experiences and be like, yeah, you have struggled. That was the best thing about it for me, I think.
Well, and the thing about it is, once you know it is ADHD, then you can start researching the workarounds that might work for the ADHD brain and testing to see which ones work for you. And once you have success on one of those workarounds, you start to think, oh, well, I could implement another one, and a third one. Versus if you're not sure that it's ADHD, and it could be anxiety, it could be depression, it could be, a learning challenge. You're always, I don't know, I feel like you're just not as dialed in, right, to what the options might be to feel more comfortable and to feel like you're actually able to manage it.
Yeah, definitely.
So what has changed since you were diagnosed?
I think largely it is the fact that I can be kinder to myself. For many, many years, I would beat myself up because I wouldn't be able to do, I wouldn't be able to, I'd forget things, or, I couldn't make myself do things that I didn't want to do. And then I would spend hours off on a tangent, like hyper focusing on something. And then I'd be like, oh, well, I haven't actually managed to achieve that thing I really needed to do today because I got distracted. And then I would be really horrible to myself about it. So I think since that, my inner critic is more forgiving, should we say. She's still there. I mean, it's 36 years worth of, okay, maybe not that long, but 30 odd years of not being very nice to yourself. Doesn't disappear overnight. But that's been the biggest thing for me. I think things I've struggled with, I think my family, they kind of still don't really accept that I've got ADHD, even though I've got a diagnosis. I think they feel like, oh, you're over pathologizing. Does it really matter? And that's hard. I find that really difficult, actually, that they, they're not interested. They don't ask me about it. They don't say, oh, are there things that we could do to help you? And I feel like if that was my daughter or my partner that had got diagnosed with something, that they felt the need to wait for 2 years to get on the list and get diagnosed. If they felt there was that much of a need, clearly they feel they're really struggling with something. So I think I'd just be asking a few more questions and trying to understand how I could help them, so that's been hard, actually. And I don't really know how to change that, because I feel like every time, these conversations are brought up, or I try and bring things up, there's some amazing writers in the UK writing articles in newspapers about ADHD in women, especially late diagnosed women, and recounting their experience, which in the large proportion is similar to my experience. And I'm kind of, subtly like leaving the newspaper article there to hope that somebody might read it. And then that's not happening. And I'm like, how have you not got an interest in this? So that's something that I really want to try and work on. And maybe it's tied into the rejection sensitivity, in that I feel like if I tackle it, it's going to explode into a big argument, and then I'm like, oh, maybe I don't even want to unpick that scab, so that's challenging and something I'm still working on, that's for sure.
They're not acknowledging your experience, right? And it's clearly something that is so important to you, and we want those around us to love and appreciate us the way we are. And if instead they're just discounting it and saying, oh, well, that's not really true. Like, I'm curious, you said your husband, I actually wrote down when you talked about how your husband didn't mark any of the things, what does your husband think now? So even though you're saying these are the things that I'm struggling with, he's come back with, well, I still don't see it.
Yeah, so I said earlier, I worked as a forensic scientist for many years. And so that role that I did was I would examine clothing, weapons, any objects really, for blood. So tiny, tiny spots of blood down the microscope. So very, very focused work. And his attitude is, there's no way you can have ADHD. You did that job for years and you loved it. You would spend like 3 days searching a black jacket for tiny spots of blood. And I said to him, yes, because I was so fascinated by that, what had happened. I wanted to discover the story of what the blood pattern showed on the jacket. So in order to do that, I needed to search for the blood. And then when I found those tiny blood spots, the dopamine hit was like, whoa, something out of this world, So, but I think when somebody has a neurotypical brain, they just cannot seem to understand it. And I think there is an element from many of my nearest and dearest that I guess maybe they feel guilty that I've struggled for so long and they didn't realize. And I'm not saying they should have realized. Yeah, and my husband, we've been together a long time. But a lot of that is down to the fact that I hid it so well. I'm in no way am I casting any blame on anybody. But now we know that this is the situation. I'm like, come on, can you not just like cut me some slack here, But I still find myself masking. It's only been a year for me where I've really been able to trust that I do have it. because I thought I'd had it for a long time. But you gaslight yourself, don't you? You tell yourself that, oh, well, maybe it isn't that, or maybe it's something else, or maybe I'm just like a tired mom and I've got lots going on, and that's why I am the way I am.
You are doing exactly what women do. We internalize our symptoms. It sounds to me like you got really good grades in school and you became this perfectionist. You masked, just as well as you possibly could. But over time, that's really exhausting. And that is actually what causes the anxiety and the depression. So I wonder if your family knew that, you could have continued on trying to cope the way you were, but it would have just led to more anxiety and more depression. And unfortunately, as we get older, well, we know that all bodies, men, women, whomever, we don't make enough dopamine. And that is what ADHD is. We don't make enough. We don't process it the same way. They don't know for sure. But every decade, I think starting from your 20s, your dopamine is reduced by 10%. And what we know about women is estrogen modulates dopamine. So there are certain times in our life where our estrogen is bouncing around, puberty, pregnancy, postpartum, and then perimenopause and menopause. And so we already know dopamine's going down by 10%. And then we deal with perimenopause, menopause, and our estrogen is going to go down, which means our dopamine is going to go down. By the time you get into your, mid 40s and 50s, you're really going to struggle with the anxiety and depression, because not only does estrogen modulate dopamine, but serotonin and all the rest. So, it also could have been that you've been able to cope just great, but you hit that, that midlife stage, 40s and 50s, and all of a sudden you literally cannot cope anymore. It's almost a little cruel to discount what it is that you feel, that you're the only person that knows that.
I mean, I just can't get my head around it, really. But I don't think I'm alone in it, from talking to other either late diagnosed or people that think they might have ADHD as well. It's a really common story, because I think people just think, oh, well, you're just trying to, why does everything have to have a label? And it's like, but if that label helps you to feel like you're accepted and to realize that you're not broken, there's nothing wrong with you. For years I'd be like, why can't I just get this? Why can't I get this together? Why can't I turn my brain off? Why is my brain so constantly on the go? And I just can't stop like panicking about things happening that aren't going to happen, but I'm panicking that they're going to happen. The number of times I would like ring my mum for a chat or whoever, and I wouldn't be able to get hold of her, and my brain would go to like the most horrific places. You don't even want to think about some of the things that I would imagine had happened. And that is, like you say, it's so exhausting, because it takes it out of your nervous system just gets absolutely fried.
Absolutely. And what I always say about all relationships is, they're either about power or connection. And the whole idea of power is that I've got to be right, rather than really being willing to understand your experience so that we can connect better. Because ultimately, that's all we want, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to be right. We just want to feel like we're cared for.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. It's not about, who's right or wrong. It's just about, I hear you, I'm here for you, I support you. What can I do? And that goes, I hope I do that with my friends and loved ones, again, not something that comes naturally, especially to Brits. I think the whole kind of don't talk about your emotions thing. We're not so great at that, but I've always been a really emotional person. I've always, when I was younger, it was always like, oh, you're too sensitive. You get so emotional about things. Why? And, but that's who I am. And finally, after 36 years of being that way and trying to, block it and not show it, I now actually feel like, well, I am who I am. And I've tried to change it for 36 years. And all it's left me with is like raging anxiety and the feeling that I'm not good enough. So how about I just let myself be who I actually am?
And all that emotion is responsible for, unlimited empathy, which is one of, our biggest strengths. So I do think we need to play into that. But you're right. It's society. It's, and then, you have these brains too that are very different, that are very linear, where no, we're just going to keep believing what we believed. And, I hear you, and I experience some of this as well, even still today, given all the things that I've done within this area,
Wow.
where you get the sense that some people are just like, oh, whatever, that's just a bunch of, excuses, whatever. What can we do? We can only focus on ourselves, right? We can't change other people.
Exactly.
So I would love to know a little bit about what you do with respect to mindful gardening. I had never heard of mindful gardening, but in my experience, I love to garden. And it has been the one thing throughout my life that if I am stressed and spinning and, up there in the thoughts, I don't know what it is. If I go out in the garden, I don't think about any of it. And I can't understand why, because I'm not doing anything really, right? I'm using my hands. I'm focused on, plants, flowers, earth. I love flowers. So why wouldn't my brain be like on total, top speed overwhelm? When I go out there, that's not what happens. It's the exact opposite. And so I was really fascinated by what you do, because that was my experience as well. Certainly before ADHD, if I was feeling anxious, I just knew to go outside and garden, and that would immediately calm my nervous system, and I would feel so much better. And so when I found you, I just thought, this is really interesting. I want to talk more about this.
So I moved into a house that had a garden, if I'm really honest. That's how I got into it. My grandparents and my parents had always gardened, but my grandpa did it, but he was retired and had a lot of time. My parents did it, but it was a bit more of a chore, like, oh God, we've got to weed the flower beds, or we've got to cut the grass, like, in amongst all the other stuff we've got to do. And then when I moved into the house that I live in now, it had quite a big, well, I say a big garden, not big in terms of the garden sizes that you guys are used to, but in the UK, it's a medium-sized garden, put it that way. And it was quite overgrown. There were elements that were like a bit of a blank canvas, not really much going on, but it wasn't in a good way, really. So I just, thought, oh, well, I better add that as another thing to do on the list, as all the household stuff and whatever else to do. And got kind of out there pretty much, like, we moved in the January. So I think probably like once the weather started to warm, I kind of thought, oh, I better venture out here and see what's going on. And I really quickly realized, exactly as you described, that my mind was quiet for the first time probably in my life. And I thought, oh, this is nice. What's going on? And, it gave me a lot of space to process a lot of the emotions that I had kind of pushed down as well, because by then it's about 10 years ago now, so I was mid-20s. I didn't have kids at that point, but I worked in a pretty nasty industry, like I saw a lot of horrible stuff. And as we've discussed before, the Brits don't really talk about emotions very much, so I just kind of got on with it. But actually, some of the stuff I was seeing was really not very good for my mental well-being. And getting out in the garden and being able to quiet my mind really helped me to kind of allow those things that I'd crammed down to kind of come to the fore. And there's almost something, as you describe, about those thoughts kind of almost moving from your brain into your body and almost being like released somatically in a way, because you're kind of just moving, you're weeding or you're sowing seeds. They're not particularly big movements necessarily, unless, you're shoveling a load of compost or something. But there's something about that state that you can get into, that flow state, where, you can start to process those things and let them go. And that's what I needed. I had like 26 years worth of like emotions that were like stuck inside my body and my brain. And that was every now and again manifesting in some like mad anxiety, like overwhelm, couldn't sleep, was like sweaty and, oh God, just awful, crying regularly. And yeah, so I just started to garden. And then it wasn't until a good while later, I actually ended up burning out, because I was just taking on too much at work. And again, that burnout period, I used my garden to heal me, basically, to take those slow steps kind of back into the real world. And then I didn't turn it into a business, if you will, until I had my first daughter. And that time away from the quite intense industry I was working in gave me a bit of time to reevaluate, I guess, and thought, you know what, I need to get this thing that is so powerful for me. I need this to get out to more women. And how am I going to make that happen working in forensics? It's not going to happen. And so I started slowly to do that. So I started when I was at university. My Saturday job was on a flower stall. I worked as a florist on a flower stall. So I started with what I knew, because although I could garden, I was very much self-taught and still am, to be fair. So there was that whole imposter syndrome thing of like, oh, well, I can't teach people to garden yet because you know, I haven't done that as a job before, so I better not do that. But I'll teach people how to make flowers. So I started with a mindful Christmas wreath making. You must do wreaths in the States. Yeah, of course you do. But over here, there's like big bright ones, but then a big movement is actually, you know, foraging for lovely foliage and stuff to go on it, and then making wreaths. So I, you know, basically just put up a table in my like kind of front room and set up a website, invited everybody I knew, and did some flyers in the local area, and then had like just 5 women in each session. And I still to this day run those and keep them small, because I think I really wanted to create this really beautiful, like relaxing experience where, you know, women, busy lives, lots going on. They just needed a break, so they could come to me for those 2 hours, do something with their hands. So they got that lovely quiet mind, you know, had some nice festive nibbles, and you know what was creating. So powerful. Yeah. And do you know what came out of it? As people were creating with their hands, the most amazing conversations started to flow. You know, 5, 6 women in a room, never met each other before. And yet some of the things they started to talk about were really big emotional things that, you know, they obviously just really needed to get off their chests. And something about being in that safe space and the creation and the connecting with nature just really allowed them to kind of to share. And, you know, so many of them afterwards, and still to this day, will message me afterwards and say, do you know what? It was the most wonderful, cathartic evening, and I didn't know I needed it as badly as I needed it. And I'm so pleased that I've come. And then I was like, well, Christmas is only once a year. So what am I going to do the rest of the year with this business? And how am I going to get it out to more people? And I just slowly started adding things on. So I actually started a mindful gardening subscription box. I started that in the March. And I basically sent different plants out to people along with activities of how to plant them or sow the seeds, depending on what it was. And I very much incorporated elements of mindfulness and engaging your senses in those. So, you know, when they received that box, not only was it an exciting treat to see what was inside, but then when they actually did the activity, I was trying to recreate that atmosphere that I'd had in these workshops for them at home. And that was around the time of the pandemic. So obviously people couldn't really go to, you know, I had loads of workshops planned and I just had to cancel them all overnight. So that was my way of getting the message about gardening and mindful gardening out to as many people as possible. But in true ADHD style, after probably about a year and a half, I probably should have called it a day before then. I didn't enjoy the buying of the plants and packaging them up and sending them out. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to create the experience, you know, and connect with people and teach them how to do stuff. I didn't want to be a warehouse operator, basically. I'd spent many years doing that back in the day for Marks and Spencer's. I don't know if your US listeners would have heard of Marks and Spencer's, but it's a very iconic British brand. You know, I used to work in their store when I was younger, and I'd done that bit. I didn't want to do that anymore. So after a while, I was like, right, I'm not going to do this anymore. And now I work one-on-one with people online. teaching them, like sometimes taking them from complete blank canvas to a garden, and we work together throughout all the 4 seasons. And not only are we creating a beautiful garden, but I'm teaching them how to connect with nature and themselves and gardening at all points through the year. Because for me, in the UK, in the winter, it is dark and miserable, but for me, I make sure even when it is cold and miserable, I get out in my garden, because that helps me gives me a bit of joy and something to look forward to. So that is the way that I work now, with people, kind of guide, like almost like a garden guide, if you will. So, I'm really encouraging them to connect with their space and grow their intuition. I think, many of us, women, and especially ADHD women, are really shut off from our intuition, especially if we've masked for a lot of our life. And I really help women to reconnect with that and start to trust in themselves again.
So, Kendall, do you offer not only the ability to take a plot of land and turn it into a beautiful garden using your own intuition, but also you weave the mindfulness aspects into it so that they're working on their mental health at the same time? How do you do that?
So what I found was, and this ramped up even further when I had the kids, I started kind of introducing some mindful elements when I had that burnout experience, and I needed to kind of get back, because when I was burnt out, my mind was like all over the place, like really bad. And I needed the garden was great, but I needed something to really anchor myself into the moment, because otherwise my brain was zipping off all over the place, and I knew I needed to get past that. So I really started to focus on my senses when I was gardening. So, when I was weeding, for example, I'd be listening for the chink of the trowel as it kind of connected with the soil, to really kind of ground myself into that moment. And then, if I was sowing seeds, rather than just getting the compost and chucking it in the pots, I'd bring it up to my face, and I'd close my eyes, and I'd take a big, inhale of the smell of the soil, and I'd just let my mind wander and just think about lovely memories that came up. Scent is such a strong connector for memories. So, for me, when I smell that kind of damp, earthy smell, it takes me back to being a kid and going for like walks in the forest with my family. And I really tried to kind of ground into that moment, and that helped my mind to stop zipping all over the place as much as it was trying to. And what I found was that, many people will say that gardening is great for their mental health. And actually, there's tons of research out there to show that gardening reduces your stress levels and it increases your well-being scores, because it gets you out there. You're not overthinking about everything going on in life. But what I have found particularly powerful for ADHD brains, and also for just busy women who have got a lot in their heads, and also who don't have a lot of time, by really incorporating these mindfulness elements and focusing on the senses and trying to be really present in that moment, it allows you to get into that calm, that flow state much quicker than if you were not engaging the senses. So some of the mindful gardening activities I teach are literally just 5 minutes long, because actually sometimes that's all you've got. If you've got a busy day of meetings, you might only have 5 minutes. So to just go outside for 5 minutes and really ground into your senses, and, deadhead some plants, for example, that's a great one, because you really have to engage your sense of sight. And that can bring your brain into that present moment, and just give you that kind of boost of quietening your mind for just those 5 minutes.
So, why do you think mindful gardening is so good for the ADHD brain?
I think it's the quietening of the mind, for me personally anyway. I think there's an element of there's definitely that, the quiet mind is by far and away the largest benefit. But also I would say there's something to be said for the helping people to trust in their own intuition again, you know, the slowing down and observing and connecting with nature, and you know, knowing that actually, you know, I think many people, especially late diagnosed women with ADHD, they don't often have a lot of confidence in themselves because of the way that the things that they've been through in their life up until getting diagnosed, you know, because they've had that inner critic that's so horrible to them. And, you know, if you can, I mean, you know it yourself, Tracy, if you've sown some seeds and then you see that little green seedling popping up out of the soil, the feeling of like power and pride and just amazement is honestly nothing better. The dopamine hit that we're getting there, you know? So for me, like a lot of people I know use exercise to help their ADHD. And I do to a point. I love to swim. But for me, gardening really helps that dopamine as well. So that, you know, and now I've got to the point where my body and my brain know my garden so well. The minute I step out into it, I can feel my body relax. I can feel my dopamine levels rising because my body and brain are trained almost now to know that, oh, we go out in the garden and I have some dopamine and can, you know, your body relaxes, your mind goes quiet. And that's why I really advocate for a regular mindful gardening practice. You know, it doesn't have to be daily, but at least 3 times a week if you can manage it, because that's what's going to keep your brain on a level. And I can tell if I haven't been out in my garden for some time, I know my brain just starts to be like, oh, like getting a bit hectic in here, or even more hectic than it always is. So, yeah, so I think that's why it's so powerful.
Well, and I know there are studies that have been done. I mean, we know that nature increases dopamine. I mean, we talk about this all the time. You know, if your prefrontal cortex is off because you're spinning and completely overwhelmed, one of the best things you can do is just go for a walk outside. You know, 10 minutes will help you calm your nervous system. So yeah, I think that's, you know, that's science. And I mean, ultimately we're animals, right? So it makes sense to me that we're part of nature. And so nature makes us feel good. I'm curious though about gardening. So, you know, the analogy I always use, and I'm trying to remember, can I even explain this, is when I talk about this hunter versus farmer philosophy of ADHD. And I talk about how neurotypicals are more like the farmers, right? And we are more like the hunters who, you know, we go out there and we have, you know, we're impulsive and, you know, we see something, you know, running by us, we're going to go take after it or go after it, versus a neurotypical would be more like the farmer, where they're sitting there, they're watching the crops grow. They go out there every morning, they pick the weeds, they pick out the buds, they plant at a certain time, they know when they're going to harvest. That is not how our brains work. So I'm curious, what tips would you give to someone with ADHD, like me, who plants a big garden, and then I'm like, oh crap, I need to weed it. I need to, you know, fertilize it. I need to pay attention to it. No, I just want to go out there and enjoy it. Like, how do you manage gardening with this kind of a brain? Because it does require consistency. And maybe that's why gardening's so good for us, right? Is because there is a built-in structure.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, I don't think ADHD gardeners are alone in the garden overwhelm. I mean, it's all I ever see over Instagram is how overwhelming my garden is. So I think, you know, we all struggle with that, but I can appreciate what you're saying is that it's even worse for ADHDers, especially because, you know, we buy all the stuff. We go hell for leather. We get it all like looking amazing within a weekend, probably, because, you know, we're just hyper focused on it like mad.
Yes.
And then it's like, oh, I'm actually a bit bored of this now. So the way that I kind of gamify it, if you will, is I have the first thing is to have a plan. So I have my own bespoke mindful gardening plan for my garden. And when I work one-to-one with clients, that's what we create for them, because obviously everyone has different plants in their garden. But I also, on my Substack, I send out regular mindful gardening activities that people can do. So the idea of these is that you just pick one like a buffet from the menu and you go out and do it. But the gamifying element is before you start whatever the activity is, notice how you're feeling, maybe how busy your brain is or how anxious you're feeling. Choose the feeling that you want to focus on, and then you do the activity. And then afterwards, you actually take the time to check in and be like, oh, okay, so how am I feeling now? This does two things. One, it makes you actually realize that you're feeling better. So you get that dopamine hit. You're actually stopping and taking notice. The other thing that it does is it helps you to realize which things in the garden you like and which things you don't. I know, or I am getting better at recognizing which things I can do with my ADHD brain and which things I am never going to do because I really don't want to do that admin or whatever, the invoicing that is just putting me off, or asking for testimonials is another one, isn't it? That rejection thing. And I bring people in to do those things for me.
Right?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. But, I then hire in help to do that because I know I'm not going to do it otherwise, but I know I need to do it in order to run a successful business. So it's the same with the garden. If you try seed sowing and you think, God, this is awful, how boring, I've got to wait ages to see the seeds. Although if you grow something, relatively quick growing, I think the dopamine hit's worth it personally. But then you decide, okay, well, I'm not going to sow from seed going forwards. I'm not going to do that. I think as well, it's easy to start and think, right, I'm going to do this entire garden. The big thing I say with my clients is start small, especially if you think in a few months' time you're going to be over the gardening hyperfocus, right? The gardening new interest. Just start small, just do one border, see how you get on with it. And what this does is it helps you to kind of grow your confidence in that area, to start to see if you think, oh, actually, I do like this. It is really good for my brain. It does help to quiet my mind. And, I feel like I can keep on top of it. And, it is true that gardens take a long time to establish. But once a border is pretty well established, there isn't too much weeding to be done, in truth be told. But what happens is very often we go hell for leather, we do the whole garden, and there's lots of gaps because obviously you need to plant plants at their right spacing.
Yep.
And weeds come in those gaps. And then you're like, oh, I've got 6 borders or 6 raised beds. Where do I even begin?
Yeah.
So that would be my tip.
And then the weeds
just
take
start
over,
with one.
right?
Well, they can do, but
the weeds take over and they ruin the plants that are there, right? Because you let them get too big. And so then you have all these misshapen plants.
Yeah, exactly. But again, something with weeding, especially in the spring, summer over here, the weeds grow very, very quickly. So on my mindful gardening plan that I've got, or, the one that I'm sending out to people, most weeks there is a 5-minute slot or a 20-minute slot. Set a timer on your phone, weed for 20 minutes, see how you get on. And some people say to me, oh, weeding though, it's really boring. And I'm like, actually, so a really simple mindset shift in terms of weeding that can actually make it quite fun and really useful is to channel any kind of, if you've got something that you've been worrying about or something that's floating around in your brain that you're like, I'm kind of done with this now. I'm kind of done. I want to get rid. Channel those thoughts into the weeds, okay? And then as you're digging in the soil, which I think personally is very therapeutic, especially if I'm a bit angry, digging into the soil and pulling out that weed and getting rid of it is almost like saying to your brain, right, you can let go of that now. Let go. Thank you. See you later. And for that, it's another way to kind of gamify and make weeding seem a bit more fun.
So the longer you're weeding, you're not only weeding your plot, but you're also weeding your brain of all the crap you don't need to have in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I love that. Love that. I think that's fantastic. How do you find time to garden though, around work and your kids and everything else that's going on in your life? Oh my God, there's a bird that just attached to the window, a bluebird.
Oh, wow. He can obviously tell we're talking about nature and he wants to get involved.
Exactly. I live in the country.
Oh, do you? Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we're kind of in a little village on the outskirts of a big town. So we've got countryside one side, town the other side. So it's kind of a little nice halfway house.
That's the best.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the best.
Yeah, so life is busy, you know. I think it's busy for everybody, isn't it? We're kind of in this society that basically tells us that unless we're constantly producing and doing and earning money and whatever else, we're kind of not really worth anything. Um, and I think for many ADHDers, this is where a lot of our shame comes from, because we sometimes can't be productive. Sometimes our brains go into shutdown because they're overwhelmed. And I think that actually one of the big missions for me is to kind of change that narrative and you know, say, you know, I make a point now in my day. I know that past 3 p.m., my brain just doesn't really want to function. I've been hyper focused and being creative on all the creative stuff that I need to do in the morning. In the afternoon, I've kind of done a bit of admin-y stuff that I don't need to use too much brain power for. And past 3 p.m., I'm kind of like, I just can't get my brain to really do, you know, anything too much that needs much brain power. So I try and use those times. So what, for me, at 3 o'clock in the UK, I have to go and get my kids from school. So I go and get them. They tend to kind of play about in the garden for a bit, certainly if the weather's nice, and I can sneak a few little gardening jobs in then. Otherwise, I always, in the summer months, once the days are longer, I will go out into the garden once the kids are in bed, because I find that a really nice kind of leveler. You know, when it's been bath time, bedtime, everything going on, to then go out into the garden and just be like, you know, just to kind of calm that nervous system before, you know, then going maybe chat to my husband or whatever else I'm going to do. That really helps me kind of punctuate the day. What I used to do pre-kids, where I used to overwork a lot, I set a timer on my phone that would go off at 5 p.m. every day. And the name of the timer was just Get in the Garden. And every day at 5, that timer would go off. And I was like, oh, it's telling me what to do. I get in the garden. And I would turn off my computer and I would get out there. Even if I was in the middle of like something, you know, I'd be like, no, I know I need to get out there. Otherwise I'm going to keep working and end up in burnout again.
Yeah.
And I would get in the garden for, you know, maybe an hour or whatever before tea. Some other ways that depending on the season, that I find quite helpful is the minute I get back from the school run, before my brain gets sucked into everything else that's going on in my day, I will take some time for the garden then. But the biggest thing that I do is I have my activities that either 5 minutes, 20 minutes and 60 minutes. And I have already planned those out. I know how long they're going to take. And on a Friday, I have a call actually with a fellow ADHD friend, and we plan our next week together. And I have a diary that time blocks, and I time block my garden time. I know what I want to do because I've got my plan. So I know what things I need to do in the month of March, for example. And I look at it and I think, oh, I fancy doing that next week. And oh, I've got 20 minutes there. Which 20-minute activity could I do? Oh, I'll do that one. And I purposefully put them in, because if I don't put them in, sure enough, I'll procrastinate on whatever work I need to do, and it will run into the time that I've allotted for, you know, if I just write garden, and I'll just let it run over. But if I've actually written like sow seeds or, you know, prune apple tree, then I'm much more likely to get out and actually do the thing. So that is key for me.
So
I know a lot of people with ADHD. I'm really specific. Yeah. And I almost like envisage myself doing it because I know, like I said, I've trained my brain so well to know that it likes going outside. So now if I can kind of visualize myself doing it, I can almost be like, oh, I know I need to get out there because I know I'm going to feel good, and my brain's going to feel good, and my body's going to feel good. And that really helps.
It's like exercise, right? Once you pause long enough to become aware of, I love how you say that, you know, whenever you're going to start any of this, you start by getting into your body and feeling how you feel. I always use a SUD score, which we use in EFT and tapping, where 0 through 10, 0 meaning, you know, you just feel great, and 10 meaning you're really anxious and you're really stressed, or maybe I should say 1 and 10. And so then when you're done, then you go back and you say, okay, how do I feel? Because we forget how we feel. We
Mm,
forget that, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. So if you have a way to measure it, then that makes so much sense. So I love how you structure it into your day. You make yourself accountable for what it is that you want to do, not what other people want you to do. But then you also really focus on how it makes me feel. So then you look forward to it next time, because you know that even though I might start and not really want to do it, I know when I come back in, I'm going to feel so much better. So we lay those neural pathways, right? And we train our brain to want that good feeling.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it works
So,
for me. I know a lot of ADHD people struggle with planning, but I'll be completely honest with you. It's the only way I've managed to achieve, you know, my degree and
yeah,
all of those things, was to just to be really structured about it. Interestingly, now
yeah,
I've had the ADHD diagnosis. I have a plan, but I do allow for a little bit of flexibility in terms of like the work. So I know what work I want to get done this week, for example.
yeah.
I don't apply it to the garden because, like I said, otherwise I'll just avoid the garden. But with work, I know what I want to get done, and I kind of say, right, this is what I'd like to do in this space. But if I then sit down and I don't feel like doing that, I won't force myself to do it, because actually, if it's something creative, it's not going to be good if I'm pushing myself. What I quite often will do is go out in the garden, like replenish my stores, and then I've almost
Yep.
got that then I get that
Yes.
creativity. So whilst I have
Yep.
a structure for the day, I will sometimes move it around to kind of hack my brain, if you will. If I'm just not feeling the vibe, I'll be like, right, I'll get out in the garden, that will make me feel good, and then I can come in. And to be honest, quite what I happens a
Totally.
lot is I'm in the
Well,
garden,
you're
and whilst I'm doing whatever I'm doing, I suddenly get this great idea, and I'm like, oh, quick, write it on my notes app, and then I've got it for when I go back in to do the work, you know.
Yeah. Well, you're ratcheting up your own dopamine that then allows you to do that next thing that you want to do, which brings you more dopamine, and so on and so forth. So I use procrastinating, and I do the same thing. If I struggle
Oh,
to start, I'll just start, because my brain, it's like visual pollution. I can't have garbage all over, because then I'm just focused on the garbage. And it sounds like you do the same thing with gardening.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Um, so, Kendall, what do you think the key to living successfully with ADHD is?
I think trying to understand yourself and how your brain works, and I think that is really hard, because I think for many of us, we don't really want to look at it. I know I didn't, and I still struggle with that now. But I think as well, experimentation. So I've had to try a lot of different things that didn't work, and going into those
Hmm.
things with an open mind and being like, okay, I'm trying this because what I'm currently doing isn't working for me. So I'm going to try this thing, and I'm going to be really honest
Yeah.
with myself. And if I like it, then it makes it into my day to day, or, you know, my daily plan. I mentioned earlier, I really enjoy swimming. I wanted desperately to be a runner. You know, I thought running's great. It's free. It's easy. I can just go whenever, although, you know, some safety concerns being a woman running around in the dark. But, you know, I was like, I really want to be a runner. I feel like if I'm a runner, then like I'm going to be great, and my brain's going to work, and it's just going to be fabulous. And then I actually hated running, and I persisted for a really long time. You know, spring would come around, the evenings and the mornings would get lighter, and I'd be like, I'm going to go out running. And I would just hate it. And it was last summer. So I'd had my diagnosis in the January, and in the summer I thought, you know what, I've always really loved to swim, but I haven't properly swum since I was like a teenager. So maybe I'll just go and give that a go. And I started, I could do breaststroke, but I really wanted to do front crawl. My body, when I get in the water, just feels amazing. My brain is quiet as I'm swimming up and down. Um, and I got in the water, and I did one length of front crawl, and I nearly drowned because I was weak and my body just wasn't used to it. And I panicked and, you know, got all up in my head about it. And every time I went swimming, I added a length of front crawl. And slowly I've got to the point where now I'm doing more front crawl than I'm doing breaststroke. And, you know, I've just really built it up. I don't worry about what other people are doing in the pool. I just focus on what is working for me.
Yeah.
And it's taken me a really long time to not get distracted by the shiny things like, oh, that works for this person, maybe I'll go and do that. Because all the while my little setup is working for me, I don't need to change it. If things start to not work, or, life shifts around and I get more time, then of course I can try other things. But I've got my swimming, I've got my gardening, I've got my Friday planning session with my friend, which I just adore. And they're the kind of things I'm doing at the minute, to kind of to help me stay on a level. So I would say that have an awareness and a real awareness of what works for you, and just try things. And don't beat yourself up if they don't work, because the beauty is we're all different, right? So not everything's going to work for you the same as it does for other people, but give it a try, because it could completely change your life like gardening did for me. So
absolutely. So Kendall, are you working on something that you want to tell us about?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I work with people over 12 months usually. But what I found with many of the people that I spoke to, they were like, oh, I don't know if I want to do a whole 12 months because, what if I lose interest after 4? Haha. So what I have set up is something called a garden glow up, I'm calling it. And it is a month, just like a month, like little snippet of time together. Because what I find with a lot of my clients is the thing that stops them getting into their garden very often is that they might have inherited an established garden that's got some plants in it, and they don't really like some of the plants, but they feel bad to get rid of them. Okay, because they're like, oh, but the people before like really loved this garden and they planted this plant with love. And I'm like, you are never going to love that garden if it's got those plants which you don't like. So we need to get rid of them. So I call my garden glow up like dopamine dressing for your garden, right? So we start with a one-off session, and we go through all the plants that potentially you've already got in your garden, and we say yay or nay. We Marie Kondo them effectively. And then in the interim, there's a couple of weeks go past while, we've the ones that we've said nay, you're digging up, you're giving them to your neighbors. That'll give you a nice little dopamine hit. You're putting them free on Facebook to give them away. I don't know if you do stuff like that in the States, like in the UK, there's these free sites.
I do.
And, you're kind of I love that, because you're kind of like spreading the gardening joy. Like it doesn't bring you joy, but it might bring someone else joy. And then we come back together and we go, right, okay, we've got some spaces now in the garden. What are we going to put in? And, it's all about kind of adding that bold color, those things that are really going to raise the dopamine. So brightly colored flowers, things that feel nice. I'm all about sensory planting. So things that make a nice noise when the wind rattles through them. Things that smell lovely or taste lovely if you want to grow something, edible as well. So it's all about then looking at what you want to include in the garden. And then you go off to the garden centre and buy whatever the plants are that we've decided. And then we have a very short session where I teach you how to plant them. Because often people are like, I don't really know how to plant these. Like, how should I space them? What should I do to make sure that they like survive well? So we have a really short session just to show you how to plant the thing. And then you get in the garden and you get planting them. So yeah, it's designed to kind of get rid of the things that are giving you that bad juju and add some things that are going to ramp up that dopamine.
So where do we find information on the Garden Glow Up?
So if you head to my website, adventureswithflowers.com, then everything is on there.
So it's on your website, Adventures with Flowers.
It's on my website.
And yeah. Can you work with anyone in the world?
Yeah, so as long as I know in the States you have different planting zones, don't you? The way they delineate them. Obviously, the UK, just the UK. But yeah, as long as the time scales match up, and we can, it might be like, obviously it's morning for you now, it's nearly the evening for me here. As long as we can make that work, and I have some understanding of your climate, then absolutely. I've had clients in Canada in the past. I've got a current client in France. So as long as we can make the time zones work, and I know kind of what your garden, the conditions your garden has to offer the plants, then absolutely I can help you.
Wonderful. Kendall, thank you so much for spending time with us here today.
That's quite all right. It's been lovely. Thank you so much.
So that's what I have for you for this week. If you like this episode with Kendall, please let us know by leaving a review. Our goal is to change the conversation around ADHD, helping as many women as we possibly can learn how their ADHD brains work so that they too may discover their amazing strengths. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you here next week.